Afternoon all. We're again here on the issue of the THA Act and the way it has been applied or maybe misapplied, interpreted or misinterpreted over the years. And we're trying to analyze, assess, and just basically have some discussion on it so that we could try to make sense of it. Now we're on the issue of the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, and the secretaries of the Assembly. Now, Section 33 of the THA Act states that the Executive Council shall comprise the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, and such other secretaries, being not more than 7, selected from among the members of the Assembly. Now, the interesting aspect of this is when one looks at the THA website, they list and they have the persons who are holding portfolios. They say, well, of course, I imagine this listing may change shortly, but it still lists Assemblyman Kelvin Charles as Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy, Joel Jack as Deputy Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and the Economy, and then it goes on to list the 7 other persons who are secretaries. So that would be Assemblyman Jomo Pitt, Secretary of Sport and Youth Affairs, Assemblyman Marcelin Melvin Jack, Secretary of Community Development, Enterprise Development and Labor. Then you have Assemblyman Hayden Spencer, Secretary of Food, Production, Forestry and Fisheries, Assemblyman Clarence Jacob, Secretary of Settlements, Urban Renewal and Public Utilities, and then you have Councillor Kwesi Devines, Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment, and then you have Councillor Nadine Stewart, Secretary of Tourism, Culture and Transport, and then you have Councillor Tracy Davidson Celestin, Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development. So, in other words, thus far it would appear that in keeping with the legislation, all right, so the legislation says the Executive Council shall comprise the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, and such other secretaries not being more than 7. So therefore, from what you have listed there, it would seem that it appears to be in compliance with the legislation. However, the conundrum in this matter appears when one examines the listing that they have for the Chief Secretary and the Deputy Chief Secretary. You see the listing for Chief Secretary being Assemblyman Kelvin Charles, and of course, as I say, that obviously would be rectified by them. But it says Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy. For Joel Jack, it says Deputy Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and the Economy. Now, where it becomes interesting is the legislation sets out the remuneration for Chief Secretary, Deputy Chief Secretary, and secretaries, right? So it says that these things shall be a charge on the fund. So in other words, you would have a salary for Chief Secretary, a salary for Deputy Chief Secretary, and a salary for Secretary. So the question arises, the 2 top positions named there in the Assembly's listing, right, as it was for the past 3 years, which would have been Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Kelvin Charles. The question arises, were these 2 positions being paid 2 salaries? In other words, did you receive a salary as Chief Secretary, and did you also receive a salary as Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy? For Assemblyman Joel Jack, the question would be, did you receive a salary as Deputy Chief Secretary, and did you also receive a salary as Secretary of Finance and the Economy? And it is a very interesting question, and it poses quite a dilemma, because if it is that you received 2 salaries, one being as Chief Secretary and the other being as Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy, then that immediately flouts and goes against the tenets of the legislation, because the legislation says, apart from the Chief Secretary and Deputy Chief Secretary, there shall be no more than seven other secretaries. So I want you all to understand the difference. It's not that the Chief Secretary cannot have a portfolio, but when you have that portfolio, it is in your capacity as Chief Secretary. It's not that the Deputy Chief Secretary cannot have a portfolio, but when you have that portfolio, it's in your capacity as Deputy Chief Secretary. So it's absolutely wrong if you have the 7 other secretary positions filled out according to the legislation to still be naming persons as Secretary for Education separately and apart from their post as Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and the Economy, because in effect the THA would have been operating illegally for the past 3 years, because in effect you are saying you have 9 secretaries separate and apart from your Deputy Chief Secretary and your Chief Secretary position. So you cannot name the person, and they certainly ought not to have been receiving separate salaries as Secretary for Education and Secretary of Finance and the Economy, if it is that their substantive positions are Chief Secretary and Deputy Chief Secretary. Because the legislation is clear. It says the Executive Council shall comprise the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, such other secretaries not being more than 7. So if you have the 7 others whom I have named, and then you are saying you also have a Secretary for Finance and the Economy, being Joel Jack, then that's 8. Then if you have a Secretary for Education, being, who was Kelvin Charles, that being 9. So then what you in effect have is 9 secretaries and a Chief Secretary and a Deputy Chief Secretary. So that's what I'm saying. If it is that you are carrying a portfolio, and I want you all to be clear and understand what I'm saying. There's nothing wrong with you carrying a portfolio. So in other words, you could be Chief Secretary with responsibility for education, innovation, and energy. So in other words, as Chief Secretary, I have given myself this additional work. But it's additional work, it's not additional pay. You cannot be drawing a second salary as Secretary of Education, Innovation, and Energy. The same thing with the Deputy Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and the Economy. You can't be drawing a salary as Deputy Chief Secretary and also drawing a salary as Secretary of the Finance and the Economy if the 7 other secretary positions are filled. Now, I want you to be clear and understand what I'm saying. It's not that you cannot hold the 2 positions. But if you do seek to hold the 2 positions, then you cannot fill out the other 7, because then you will be running afoul of the legislation. So in other words, if you as Chief Secretary want to also be a secretary, that means that when you are sending that list to the president under the legislation, okay, because the legislation sets out the procedure for that, right? It says at 33.2, the Chief Secretary shall consult with members before he advises the President in accordance with subsection 1C. And subsection 1C says, right, such other secretaries, not being more than 7, selected from among members of the Assembly as the President, acting in accordance with the advice of the Chief Secretary, may appoint. So in other words, you will basically have to tell the President, look, even though I am Chief Secretary, I am submitting my name also for you to appoint me as a secretary, because I want to be Secretary of Education also. In which case, you are then appointed separately and independently as Secretary for Education, and in such a case, then you would be entitled to draw 2 salaries because you have been appointed as chief secretary and you have also been appointed as a secretary, and you now take on the portfolio of education or whichever portfolio. Similarly with the deputy chief secretary, his name ought to have then been submitted on the list to the president of persons you are appointing as secretaries to say, well, look, I have this person as deputy chief secretary, but I want to appoint him also as a secretary from among the 7 that I can appoint, and I will give him the responsibility for finance. If you don't do so, and you have filled out the other 7, okay, because notice what the legislation says. It says not being more than 7. So in other words, you can't have 7 other secretaries and then still, in addition to that, slip in and have a secretary for education and saying, well, he's the chief secretary, and a secretary for finance saying, well, he's the deputy chief secretary. No, it cannot be. In other words, if you want those portfolios and you want it officially as a secretary in order to be able to justify you getting a salary, a second salary, then you must be on that list that is sent to the president, and your name must be appointed. You must now be appointed separately and independently as secretary, and then now you take on this portfolio officially, and then you are able to get a salary, a second salary. But you cannot appoint the 7 persons as secretary and then still say, well, I am taking on this portfolio of education, so I will call myself chief secretary and secretary for education, as if you have 2 separate appointments. You do not. You only have 1 appointment. So in such a case, the correct thing would be to say chief secretary with responsibility for education and deputy chief secretary with responsibility for finance. So it's important. Now, I mean, I am never into politics, so I don't know what has been transpiring, whether it's been 1 salary paid or 2 salaries, but it's a question we have to look at. And it's not a question of pointing fingers or casting blame. It's a matter of us trying to assess and analyze the legislation so we understand it going forward so that mistakes are not made in the future. But it is pellucid when you look at the legislation that if you have the 7 other secretaries appointed, it is impossible for you to have listed officially on your website that you're claiming to have 2 additional secretaries, being your secretary for education, who you're saying is the chief secretary, and your secretary for finance, who you're saying is the deputy chief secretary. That is illegal. That is very clear. The legislation says there shall be no more than 7 secretaries. So in other words, if you have the 7 secretaries and you have the chief secretary and deputy chief secretary, fine. You can't have the 7 secretaries, deputy chief secretary and chief secretary, and then you slip in 2 additional secretaries. So in other words, that title that is listed on the THA's website and that the last incumbent, Mr. Charles, has carried of Secretary for Education, that is wrong, that is illegal. That title that the Deputy Chief Secretary, Mr. Joel Jack, has been given and has been carrying, and of course we're not casting blame or aspersions on anyone at all, but the point is, the reality is that that title of Secretary for Finance is illegal if you have 7 other secretaries appointed by the president. Because the legislation is clear, it says no more than 7. So in other words, what you might be is, as I said, the deputy chief secretary with responsibility for finance. So in other words, all you really are doing is giving yourself more work, but no extra pay and no extra title as secretary for finance. You cannot carry that title legally, legitimately, and lawfully, because the legislation limits the THA to 7 other secretaries separate and apart from the chief secretary and deputy chief secretary.